Hi, everyone. My name is Danny Hertzberg. I'm the Senior Director of Mid-Market and SMB Sales here at Slack. I'm really excited to be here today, talk to you about Slack Connect, and interview one of the world's best sales leaders about how her team uses it too. So high level, here's what we plan to cover during today's session. We'll walk through the specific challenges that sales teams face when connecting with prospects and customers. We'll illustrate what Slack Connect is and how it drives value for sales teams. And we'll hear from the woman leading all of revenue across Americas at Stripe and learn how Stripe's sales team uses Slack Connect with over 70 of their customers. All right, let's get started. So ever since March, the big question on my mind and nearly every sales leader's mind is this: how can we forge the same depth of relationships with our prospects and customers as we used to back when we got to meet them face-to-face? In the past, we would fly to a customer's headquarters, we'd meet them in person, and we would learn so much about the company just by walking the halls and meeting folks before and after meetings, having that small talk, and perhaps taking them out for a meal. Today, what we want to show you is how Slack Connect can help forge that same level of depth in a new approach to selling your product. So first, let's paint the contrast. In a world without Slack, email is the dominant force in customer communications, followed by virtual meetings. And the thing is, there's some serious shortcomings to both of these. Email is a black box. It can be overly formal. It puts people in siloed threads, and it's hard for new people to catch up and figure out what's going on. And meanwhile, video conferencing provides a virtual replacement, technically speaking, for face-to-face sales. But when they're over, the conversation ends abruptly and everyone disappears back into their day jobs. What's more, customer experience takes a hit because interactions are infrequent and very formal. Some of the most important interactions happen before and after that meeting, and it's almost impossible to recreate that over email or through a video conference. Lastly, email makes it hard to close customer feedback loops and route feedback to the right people. Have you ever sent an email to someone, waited for their reply, found out they're not the right person, added another person in, et cetera, et cetera? Exactly. So the question is, how can Slack Connect help solve these issues? Let's dig into that. Slack Connect allows you to securely communicate with your customers to build stronger relationships and expedite sales cycles. Most people here today are familiar with Slack as an internal communications tool. You communicate with your colleagues in Slack channels rather than emails, right? Now you can securely do the same with folks who don't work within your company. So what does that look like here at Slack? Within Slack, the sales and customer success teams use dedicated channels to communicate both internally and externally about an account. And we share external channels with our prospects and customers. We use these naming conventions that you'll be able to see here to denote whether we're using that channel internally and externally for clarity. Internal-only channels are used by account teams to join forces on an account. They bring together account executives, customer success managers, solutions engineers, leadership, perhaps cross-functional stakeholders, anyone who's involved in driving that sale forward. External channels include the entire group I just mentioned, plus the buyers themselves, the prospects. And we clearly denote the prospect's profile with their company logo in there. And we give ourselves a chance to interact with more speed, more depth, less formality. So how does Slack Connect impact the way we sell here? Well, our sales reps can send over proposals directly to the customer and get a real-time response. What you're seeing here is a real example from one of the sales reps on my team that we anonymized. And so in this example, Zoe sent the proposal to our customer, Matt. He was able to read it over quickly and respond instantly. Not only that, but he shared personal details about his new office in there. And what you're witnessing in this slide is the bond solidifying right in the channel. As a leader, I'm also getting a much better sense of the forecastability of this deal based on the speed of the response time and some of those personal details that Matt's sharing. Here's another example of what rapport looks like once you've truly built some trust. We've had customers send photos of their nurseries in the making, karaoke contests, home renovations, you name it. You get to know one another's human side very quickly and naturally through Slack Connect. Finally, responding quickly to a customer is crucial to maintain that trust you've built. Routing feedback to the right team is easy. There's no more forwarding emails, looping them in, forcing them to try to piece together the conversation. Instead, you take direct customer feedback and you send it along to the product team to review. So these are just a small handful of ways I've seen our sales team use Slack Connect to execute deals faster and build closer relationships with our customers. And now I'm excited to welcome one of Slack's very own customers, Stripe, here to our session to talk about how Slack Connect is used in sales at Stripe. First, a bit of context. Stripe has been one of our earliest adopters of this feature and uses channels throughout the sales cycle. So I'm very excited to talk with Jean DeWitt Grosser, who is head of America's revenue and growth at Stripe. Welcome, Jean.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Let's kick it off. To kick off, can you tell us a little bit more about Stripe and your role at the company?
Sure. So Stripe provides online payments and more broadly economic infrastructure for the internet. Our mission is to increase the GDP of the internet, so really help enable online commerce. My guess is, knowing a decent amount about Slack, that there's a fair amount of overlap between some of your customers and prospective customers and ours, so probably quite a few Stripe users in the audience, actually. At Stripe, I run revenue and growth for the Americas. So that's basically end-to-end customer lifecycle. So we have teams that are doing outbound prospecting, account executives that are working with customers or prospects that haven't yet picked Stripe and partnering with solutions architects, deployment functions, account management. And then these days, we actually have quite a few products beyond payments. And so product specialists that'll also focus on those. And then lastly, while Stripe certainly got its start with startups, these days we sell to all sorts of customers and so have teams that focus on your earliest stage startups all the way through Fortune 1000 companies globally.
Great. Thank you. Jean didn't mention this, but she was a very early employee at Stripe and has seen the company grow and mature quite a bit as her org has also grown and matured. So what I'm curious to ask you, Jean, is as a sales leader, what are some of your top priorities today?
Yeah, I mean, we are fortunately continuing to scale really rapidly. And so there are a couple of things we're really focused on. The first is on the enterprise side of things. What folks probably don't know as well as you may about Stripe's orientation around developers and startups is actually these days, a huge percentage of our revenue comes from enterprise. And so we spent the last few years really focusing as a sales organization on our approach to acquiring and working with the enterprise market. The second area we're also focused on is, when I started, we really were just selling payments. And now I think Stripe has 7, depending on how you want to count them, different product lines. From Connect for marketplaces to Stripe billing for SaaS companies like Slack. And so we're really working on how do we adjust our go-to-market motion and our sales organization to be multi-product oriented. And then lastly, and I think this will dovetail well with the conversation today, but we're really trying to figure out how to craft what we call the Stripe sales way. We want it to feel fundamentally different to be sold to by Stripe and are figuring out how to make that happen.
Let's dig into that part. So how has your team been able to flex and build meaningful relationships with your customers as you create that new approach to selling?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think has been kind of unique about Stripe is from the early days, John and Patrick, our co-founders, were known for really being on the front lines with customers. They answered support tickets until I think we had hundreds of employees. They were also known for being our implementers. And so they would literally show up, at some startup's garage and sit down and, write code next to them to get them live on Stripe. So it's been really important to the two of them that we keep a very human element in our sales process. And so one of the things, we've done as we've thought about how do we really bring our products to life is how do we build meaningfully different relationships. And so certainly we can talk about how Slack is enabling that. And then we also think pretty in depth about, we're an API, we're a technology company at the end of the day. So how do you really make the technology shine for engineers at these companies?
That's great. Let's double down on the building meaningful relationships part. How did the sales team at Stripe get started with Slack Connect, and how does it play a role in that?
So we were a user of, I think they were called shared channels before Slack, sort of the precursor to Slack Connect. Mm-hmm. So it's really been a part of our sales process since I arrived at Stripe. And part of that stems from the fact that our initial audience was really selling to startups and developers. And so there was just a ton of pull from our customers to say, we'd prefer to be in Slack, than over email with you. And over time, we figured out that it really does deepen relationships and shorten sales cycles by utilizing Slack. You just get into a much more real-time communication motion. So, on the one hand, we've historically, I think a lot of folks in sales have known that the kind of gold standard of a deep relationship is you get the person on text, right? So that you can check in with them after a meeting and really get a sense for what happened. And so now we say kind of the gold standard is we get them into a shared Slack channel. And similarly, another kind of, key concept in sales is what we call the law of 2X, where you'll have a meeting on Monday, you have, follow-up action items with the customer or the prospect. And there's a tendency for the salesperson to then schedule the next meeting the following Monday, when frankly, it probably could have happened the next day, and accelerated decision-making. And so we find that by having the shared Slack channels, that iteration, that dialogue happens in real time rather than, the next time you can get calendar schedules to align.
That's great. Can you paint the picture for us? So what does it look like when you use Slack Connect with your customers throughout the deal cycle?
Yeah, so we really use it everywhere. We use it from a pre-sales perspective, where we'll have our account executives as well as our solution architects on our side in a channel that's shared with the customer, and you'll have their developers, you'll have their head of payments, you'll have folks from their finance department. And so often, you might have a formal meeting where you're presenting an overview, doing a demo, and then have a bunch of follow-up on more information they were going to provide us, things we can clarify. And so we'll go back and forth afterwards. We also really heavily use it during the integration phase. So once you sign a deal and now the company is actually writing code to go live with Stripe, they have a ton of questions. And so this lets them get unblocked immediately versus, again, sort of having to wait to compile everything for a weekly meeting. And then we also use it similar to how you showed in your presentation for existing customers, where we'll sometimes have multiple Slack channels per customer to align different teams. But again, use that for everything from reviewing metrics on a weekly basis to working through integration challenges as folks continue to scale.
Super helpful. Thank you. So you're using it across all phases of the sales cycle. I'm curious, just contrast the difference for us. What's the difference between using Slack versus other communications like text, as you said, the former gold standard, or email that sales teams used to rely on?
Yeah, I think it's more in line with the cadence of the business these days. So one of the things that we talk a lot about with our customers is we believe that moving to Stripe helps them be more adaptive, right? To be able to move more quickly. And communications are a big part of moving more quickly as well. So with email, often things are like you mentioned, sort of sitting in an inbox, waiting for the right people to get on thread, not clear exactly who's meant to respond because you've got 20 people on the to line, et cetera. So we feel like it really just lets both sides work in real time.
What does it look like to use Slack versus other communication methods? Like you mentioned, text earlier is the past gold standard, or email that sales teams used to rely on.
Yeah, so I think the big difference is that it really lets you interact in real time so that people remain unblocked. So for email, as you mentioned, often those messages are going to sit in your inbox. You've got a bunch of people on the two lines, so it's not obvious who's in charge of responding. And here instead, as things come up throughout the day, folks can engage.
Perfect. And can you illustrate some specific examples that the Stripe sales team has used to close a deal within Slack?
Yeah, probably one of the best examples is actually with one of our largest partners, an e-commerce platform that I think a lot of you probably would be familiar with. So this is our most robust use of Slack by far. I think we have 5 different Slack channels with them. Some of them are very topical for meaty things that come up, and then some are broader. And with them, we actually have a full shared norms doc where we've gone through on both sides to articulate what are, SLAs on both sides, what are things that belong in the Slack channel versus need to go through, say, a formal ticketing process, as an example. And then all the standing topics, and obviously you link out to your running agendas for meetings, et cetera. So that's actually been sort of our internal gold standard for how you set things up. And had a great example actually last week where we're trying to launch a new payment method in Japan with them. And we're working out a couple kinks right before go live that started on email. And after 2 back and forths, we flipped it over into Slack. And, within 5 minutes, we'd actually figured out the issue.
I love that example. 5 channels with 1 customer is pretty impressive and speaks highly of, how in depth you go with your customers. So thank you for that. I'm curious about the post-sale part too. Once you've closed the deal, how do you hand it over to the next phase of implementation across the teams you lead?
Yeah. So, often there's some people that were in the pre-sales process that aren't going to carry across into the post-sale. So one of the things we do is once we've closed a deal, we'll do a scoping session for integration. And during that meeting, we pull in our integration engineers and our implementation consultants, and then your developers, your product managers, and other key folks at the customer to figure out how we're going to spend the next weeks and months deploying Stripe. And from there, we then typically initiate with that group a Slack channel where, again, we'll have links to the integration guide that we've built out together, links to the meeting notes, and sort of like I said, we'll often have meetings to review some things in a lot of depth, but then all of the active follow-up happens in channel afterwards, including often sharing code. So keeps us going throughout the course of the week.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's end before Q&A on this final question. What are you excited about as Stripe reinvents the selling process?
I'm excited about exactly that. So one of the things I always tell my team is, if you wanted to work in sales in the technology sector and you were to have asked, in the 70s and 80s, who is the best at this? People probably would have answered IBM. If you ask that question again in the 90s, folks would have said Oracle. If you ask that question again in the thousands, they would have said Salesforce. And I really don't believe that anybody has become the leader in how to sell in this era that's much more online oriented. Customers are self-educating. And you also have much more of platform-oriented products where it's much more bespoke and specific to the company, ultimately what you buy and how you use things. So we're very excited about trying to figure out how you craft this Stripe sales way to really sell in this much more dynamic and customized environment, and are early on our journey, but I think figuring out a couple good things.
I feel that excitement. It's infectious. And I think that's inspiring for everyone listening. The playbook is yet to be built, and we all have a chance to pioneer it. So thank you so much, Jean, for sharing exactly how you guys use Slack Connect and what you're doing to innovate right now. We feel really lucky to have you as a customer and sharing your wisdom about Slack Connect for sales.
Thanks for having me.